Hello and welcome to the DFW Divorce Insider Podcast, answering all the questions you didn't know you had about family law. I'm your host, Matthew Eichson, and our guest for this episode is a family lawyer and the founder of Concilium Divorce Consultations, Heidi Webb. How are you doing today, Heidi?
I am doing very well. Thank you for asking, Matthew. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for asking. So today we are changing our typical focus just a little bit to talk about something that you do, this idea of divorce consultations. And to begin with, could you just very briefly explain what that is, what a divorce consultant does?
Sure. Really, what I tried to do is break down the traditional silos between psychology, law, and finance so that those components of a divorce, which are all very much interrelated, can be seen from the outset as something that's integrated and not sort of not served well by the process itself. So, what I often found practicing law traditionally was that people would get to the end of a divorce process and then try to address things that they could have addressed 18 months, 2 years, 2.5 years earlier sometimes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, I have heard of divorce coaches, but as I understand, that's a different thing. Could you just briefly explain how a divorce consultant differs from a divorce coach?
Sure. I really termed the divorce consultant as a term to differentiate it from coaching. So I'm glad you asked that question. In my experience, coaches are people who primarily came to the process through their own divorce or an interest perhaps in divorce because they were a child of divorce. They've had some experience that was to them, very important. And they feel like they've learned a lot from the experience and they want to be able to share and be empathic with someone who's going through an experience that they feel like they can relate to very well and sort of be a guide. The difference is that I've done, 1,500 divorces if I've done one. I've been a divorce law practitioner for many, many years. So my lens is broader. It's not that I see it just through one potentially a contentious case or one case that went really smoothly, but I've seen many different kinds of cases. And from that, have been able to develop sort of a more nuanced understanding of the many factors that go into cases and can contribute to their outcomes being more or less smooth. So that sort of vantage point I can offer as a lawyer is different. And because prior to going to law school, I did my master's degree at Harvard in education and psychology, I bring that sort of focus to children, sort of into children's experience up front from the very beginning. And the integration of those things, I think, differentiates the consulting practice from a coaching practice.
And so you, as you said, you're a very experienced family attorney. And what gave you the idea to start Concilium divorce consultations?
Yeah,
Was there some specific moment?
I think, like in many people's lives, there are different things that sort of direct or sort of culminate in somebody making a decision. But there is something that really stood out in my mind is if I had to sort of point my finger to a particular moment, um, it was on account of a sort of a very sad experience. I'd been practicing for many years and I had taken some time off to be with my own children. That's not the sad part of the experience, that's the happy part of the experience. But having stepped off the path gave me an opportunity to look back at it with eyes that were different than perhaps if I had just sort of stayed doing what I've been trained to do and continued on that path. So during the time I was what I would consider, sort of out of the practice, I was watching the news one night, and on to the 11 o'clock news flashed a photograph of a young Marine who'd been killed in Iraq, and I recognized him as the son of a former client of mine. So it was very sad, obviously, to see that. And I called her and ended up going to the funeral. And at the funeral, one of his high school teachers eulogized him and said that the reason he joined the Marines was because he felt like he'd never had a family. And I sat there in that pew and I just thought, what could I have done differently? I thought at the time we did everything we possibly could to try to secure custody for his mom, to try to make sure the family was financially secure. Um, and we thought we were attending to the needs of the children, but clearly his experience wasn't that. He didn't feel whole at the end of that process. And it made me start rethinking what I could have done differently and how I maybe could have started the process with different questions, asking the mom different questions, asking her about what would be important in the restructuring of her family, how she envisioned this decision being a positive for her, why was she doing it, and would have led me to a different outcome, I think, in terms of how I began that process. That being said, it was a case that involved domestic violence. It was a case that involved both parents were physicians. They'd gone through med school together. They had a lot of, shared experiences. There was a lot of, clearly a lot of, very extraordinary emotion in that case. But with all that being said, I think how you posture something from the beginning is hugely impactful, and how I've witnessed myself many, many times over now, how facts that begin just that way can be carried out very differently than they were in that case.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds like it would be an eye opener for anyone. Um, So you talked about that this led you to think about if you were asking the right questions.
Mhm.
So could you describe for us now, now that now that you have been running Consilium for some time, what are the questions that you decided were better questions to ask, and then what are the sort of typical steps in the divorce consultation process?
Sure. So really, I sort of flipped it on its head. So instead of, the typical way that lawyers begin a case is if there's a contest or sort of a disagreement between the parties, is they file a complaint and then they get an answer and then they proceed down the discovery path, which is sort of like landing in Rome, not speaking Italian for most clients. I mean, they just don't have the experience, they don't understand the language, and it's very overwhelming. And it's postured in sort of as English contract law, which we sort of inherited as a system, sets things up. So if you think of it as if two people or two businesses or two parties don't have information about each other, it's actually quite a streamlined approach to gathering information that you need. If, on the other hand, as in a marriage, most people have a lot of the same information, and the same process probably doesn't serve people in the same way as it does when they don't have access to the same information, which isn't to say that that's true all the time. There are certainly times when money's hidden. There are certainly times when someone has been locked out of financial decisions. I mean, there are times when the only way to access information is through court orders. But that being said, that's not the majority of cases. So instead, what I started asking people about were what they hoped their outcomes would look like and how they envisioned their future and how they hoped to get there, what their restructured family would look like. And that starts from the very beginning. And sort of, I go through a 7-step process with clients from that very initial intake to helping people assess and envision a future and creating that sort of parallel path simultaneously with the divorce process. So what that often entails for someone is, when people start saying, I want this because, you hear part of the reason of the dissatisfaction with the relationship. But oftentimes there's also, I feel like I abandoned my dream of going back to graduate school or starting a business or living in a place I wanted to live different from where I am. I mean, there are many different visions people have of their lives that don't comport necessarily with how they're living. So how do you achieve that? And what about the divorce process can actually advantage someone to that? So if you pre-think those questions, then sometimes you can build into a divorce agreement, for instance, payment for graduate school, instead of just alimony that ends at a certain point, and then people are left saying, what do I do now? Or if you're going to want to move from this state, what's that mean in terms of removing children? Is that something that's clearly something that needs to be thought about at the beginning? And how realistic is that? And how good is that for the children? So then there's the all the decisions regarding process, whether or not a case should be postured in the traditional litigation mode, or whether mediation, collaborative law, uh, sort of consultations, or retired judges sometimes offer arbitration services, or other sorts of forms of evaluative processes that can help during the process. So then what we do at the Concilium process is we help people then find appropriate counsel and professional support networks for this process. And we stay on as a consultant throughout the whatever the process is, and then follow up with making sure that the outcomes that they hoped would achieve are achieved, and sort of check in with clients along the way to make sure that they're moving along both paths in a way that they want to. And the other huge advantage, I must say, that I see is that rather than having a sole goal of being divorced and sort of creating tunnel vision around that, when people have a parallel path of growth simultaneously, their sort of mental health throughout the process tends to be better, because they also are sort of have a positive focus on their life, not just sort of the drain of the divorce for the entire time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That yes, so almost a bespoke approach, sort of fitting it to each individual person, as opposed to just jumping into the litigation process and seeing what will happen.
Exactly. And it is very tailored when I work with an individual. I wrote a book about this process called Dissolution to Evolution, which is available on our website and at Amazon. But and that's sort of a more broad, I try to take the elements that I work with people individually on, and if people are in Texas or in other places where I'm unlikely to work with them, although I do sort of do parts of the concilium process, not the legal representation parts, but parts of the legal process with people out of state. But it is a way for people to sort of upfront understand, and maybe for themselves help frame the process, I hope, more deliberatively.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Indeed. So, do you find that, generally speaking, this leads to a change in people's outlook as opposed to when they sort of approach litigation or divorce in the more quote unquote traditional fashion?
I do. I think, I try to use language that's different as well. And I don't really focus on the word divorce as much as restructured families, particularly, obviously, when there are children involved. Um, from the very beginning, and talk about co-parents, and start having people refer to their spouses instead of as my ex-husband, my co-parent. It's a more positive and realistic sort of assessment of what the relationship is afterwards. And I try to carry over that language for children as well, so that you don't hear people saying, he's at his dad's house, but he's at his house with dad, or he's, at his house with his dad, and vice versa. So the children have two homes, not no home. And I think the other language implicit in that language is, as a child, I don't have a home. I go to my mom's house and I go to my dad's house, as opposed to saying I go to my house with dad or my house with mom. And so flipping things so that the concepts that the family uses are sort of more child-centered and holistic, I think is healthier for everybody. And helping people really understand, especially when they have very young children, how quickly this time goes, and how much agency they can have over it or not, depending upon what they do with it. I mean, barring mental illness and drugs and alcohol and domestic violence, and there are times that clearly court intervention is necessary, and that these processes aren't effective. But assuming that we're working with people who may be in distress but have the skills to harness to move forward productively, then I think the process works really well.
Hmm. So we've covered on previous episodes of the podcast collaborative versus mediation versus litigation versus private judges and all of that. So I think our listeners have a fairly good handle on that side of it. But you also mentioned mental health of the clients and of the children.
Mhm.
Could you just talk a little bit more about what that side of the process looks like?
Sure. I think the stigma of mental health still exists, not nearly as much as when I started practicing, so many years ago. But I think from the very beginning, I hope and want most of my clients to be in therapy for gaining perspective for themselves. I will always ask if their children need to be or should be, or what they think pre-planning, even from in scripting the conversation that they'll have with their children, so that that's a conversation parents have together and that it's developmentally appropriate. And if there's a age range of children, that they're attending to each child's needs, when they hear that conversation. So you're not telling a 6-year-old what you'd be telling a 16-year-old. That there's a range, and often people have a range of kids and they feel like they just want to sit them all down together and give them the same message, which in
Hmm.
part may be right, but in part may not be. So thinking that through really carefully ahead of time is important. And I think that um, the more agency people have over the process, I find the more that they're able to sort of keep themselves sort of in check throughout the process and not be triggered as much by their spouse, who obviously is a triggering person for them during the process. Um, so I think that, is helpful. A lot of times, probably